Hey, what's good? It's Woog. What? Oh. Well, if this wasn't the most unexpected and pleasant twist of the fight calendar's recent memory. So I don't want to do a complete breakdown of both of these fighters' profiles, though we'll get into a lot of it along the way. Kamaru Usman's the current champ with a 16-1 record. Jorge Masvidal is 35-13, has never held a belt in the UFC. Correction, he holds the one-off BMF title in his win versus Nate Diaz, but no divisional belts. I just want to give my thoughts on the fight itself and just how greatly this differs from what Usman had in front of him in Gilbert Burns, who had to pull out of the main event title fight due to testing positive for COVID-19. So there's no doubt that Usman will have a problem on his hands come Saturday night in Jorge Masvidal. Jorge's the more skilled and more experienced boxer-kickboxer of the two. But I think that this fight should favor Usman more heavily than Usman versus Burns, in that Usman has a better idea on what he needs to worry about and what to strategize on as he prepares for Masvidal than he did against Gilbert, where we didn't know who would have the edge in the grappling, for instance. Usman, when all else fails, and not to say that it's happened, but he's got the combination of wrestling ability, skills, and just natural strength that he's been able to physically control, or at least half control, opponents while just beating on them. But Gilbert Burns is a multiple-time Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world champ. Always check credentials when you hear of different specialists in their various disciplines. Oh, so-and-so's a wrestler? Well, how good? A wrestling state champ? All-American? Regional champ? Or are we talking a martial artist who's the best in the world at something? Are we talking Yoel Romero, an Olympic medalist? Although, oddly enough, he doesn't use a ton of his wrestling, especially in recent years. There's levels to how advanced these fighters are in their respective primary disciplines. So Gilbert Burns is about as elite as it gets in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he had the pedigree to where we didn't even know whether Kamaru Usman's main advantage is still truly an advantage. And although Usman and Burns were training partners for some time, we just saw Gilbert Burns knock out Damian Maia and then just whoop Tyron Woodley over the course of 5 rounds in the stand-up. So we don't know how much Gilbert Burns' stand-up has improved in those last couple of years. A lot of wild cards with Gilbert. We don't know his upside, but we did know that he's an elite grappler. However, if Usman wins this fight versus Masvidal 4 rounds to 1, mostly through grappling, nobody would be surprised. Nobody should be surprised by Usman getting a leg or a waist and kind of controlling him to where the grinding and the half controls and just the ground and pound and the attrition are just wearing on Masvidal, while Usman's also eating up the clock. They can even be standing up with Usman just leaning on him, holding a wrist while hitting him with his free arm and just throwing those arm punches, threatening a takedown, foot stomps, punch, and then finally getting the takedown. Then trying to land some bigger, more violent strikes and just soaking up more and more clock when he starts getting tired. This is literally what Usman can and should do in this matchup versus this deadly, creative, and super experienced Jorge Masvidal. Usman's goal should be to imagine that there's a crowd out there, and your job is to get these people to start booing the hell out of you. That's a sign of this fight going well for Usman. Cause check it, Masvidal suddenly became one of the hottest, most infamous, and beloved fighters in MMA. Now this came suddenly, but only 16 years into his career. He's been on so many fight circuits. He was fighting street fights in Kimbo Slice's iconic backyard fight scene that was viral before viral. Go YouTube Jorge versus Ray, and you'll see him fighting this guy who could easily be 2 to 3 divisions up from him. Jorge spent nearly half of his career at 155 lightweight? The guy he was fighting was looking at least 210, and Jorge won that. Big Ray could only take so much. Jorge's fought in the Bodog promotion in the mid-2000s, Sengoku out of Japan, Strikeforce, he did Bellator for a year, and before all of that, he was on the local scene out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. This boy's a dog, in the most complimentary sense of the word. And he hasn't been KO'd or TKO'd, basically stopped via hands and feet, since like 2008. And even that fight, if you go look up Masvidal versus Rodrigo Damm, D-A-M-M, it was stopped as soon as Jorge hit the ground. That was at that World Victory Road presents Sengoku, and the ref stopped the fight immediately, but Masvidal jumped right back up. Like, he got drilled, but, he got drilled versus Darren Till before knocking him out later in that same fight. Point being, we just don't see fighters outclassing Masvidal in the stand-up. Think about it. When have you seen Jorge just eating shots and is just in over his head in the stand-up, getting dropped, outclassed, finished? When have you seen Jorge look like an Anderson Silva opponent other than Chris Weidman? I can't think of it either. I'm having flashbacks instead of Jorge looking like he was just in another league versus Cowboy Cerrone in 2017. Or fighting a pretty even fight versus Darren Till in the stand-up, though probably losing slightly before knocking Darren Till unconscious with an explosive left hook / overhand. It was a weird punch, left hook, overhand, but it was in the form of a charge. It was a sudden and fast ambush. It seems like Jorge's game has even elevated in the past 3 years. And he's no spring chicken. He's like, what, 36? 35. And sure, that Ben Askren flying knee KO might have been the most explosive couple of seconds in UFC history, but it was just a couple of seconds. But that BMF title fight versus Nate Diaz was a lopsided showcase for Jorge, where he just had the jump on Nate, technique-wise and athletically. Jorge is a bad man, and for him to be your, oh, and by the way, you're fighting this guy instead, opponent, would normally be a damning proposition. But Usman doesn't have to play that game. It would be very unwise, for instance, for Usman to fight Jorge in the way that he and Colby, two wrestlers no less, decided to fight each other, where they're both standing in the middle of the cage, trading hard jabs and power punches for several rounds. If Usman were to do that, it'd simply be out of pride and to make a statement. He shouldn't fall into that trap. Where we do see Jorge have problems is versus Demian Maia, who's the fight game's version of an aggressive virus, who's just had a lot of time to mutate and survive. We saw Jorge struggle with Benson Henderson, someone who spends a lot of his fights in Clay Guida-like positions, kind of that human backpack, just threatening chokes and locks and ground and pounding. Usman should just do what he needs to do to get the W here. Colby Covington has developed into a pretty good boxer. Look at his fights with Robbie Lawler and Demian Maia, and hell, with Usman. But he's not nearly as dynamic a striker as Jorge, whose nuance and timing are something to truly behold, and can only be learned through thousands of hours of doing nothing but that stuff. Again, watch him versus Cowboy. When Jorge has his hands up, staying light on the front foot and starts raising his knee, feinting, measuring distance with his jab hand touching, you better know what the hell you're doing in there, because he does. Usman should do everything he can to make this a boring fight. He needs to make the ref continuously give him the, you gotta work, fellas. I gotta see you work, fellas. Come on, let's go, fellas. All right, stand up, fellas. Let's go, gentlemen. If he does this, then he could probably ride that out into a 5-round decision, or he could see how much his grinding style of ground and pound just wears on Jorge and see if it weakens him to where he could then open up with some more aggressive strikes. Though I wouldn't advise it, because I think that Jorge is always dangerous. Even if Jorge's in the 5th and is down by 2 rounds, still dangerous, still deadly. I'm going with Usman by decision here, and I know that's not a super controversial or unpopular pick. A lot of people kind of know more or less what I'm picking up on here. I also think that Usman knows not to drop his head into Jorge's power like Ben Askren did when going for a takedown. I can only see Usman doing that if he's either hurt or exhausted, where Usman's just lazily going for a takedown. I don't see that. He's pretty measured in how he closes the distance. So instead of trying to get into some outrageous striking battle to please the audience, even though there's no crowd, Usman instead needs to make Masvidal start calling him out during and between rounds for not fighting his type of fight. Taunting him, grabbing on his stuff, and calling him this and that. Let Masvidal do that. But the idea is to keep Masvidal from being able to use his greatest skills. You got to beware of that random Masvidal submission attempt too. If Usman and his new trainer, super trainer, Trevor Whitman, can strategize accordingly, Usman should be getting his hand raised at the end of this. One wild card here is Masvidal's level of fitness. He took this fight on extremely short notice, and although they say that he's always walking around at near his fighting weight, I don't think that he's been mirroring the type of preparation that usually goes into a big fight. Although some could argue whether the current training methods help or hurt in terms of not so much preparation, but in ability when you're entering the cage. How much did he get beaten up and just get exhausted in the days and weeks leading up into the fight? But anyway, Masvidal is definitely not having a conventional type of training camp for this fight. I just don't see how or why he would have been training unless he was betting that heavily on COVID-19. And if he ain't in top shape, then Usman can win this by stoppage. I'm actually surprised that Masvidal's taking this fight. He finally become a star in the sport. Very, very, very few become a star in the sport. He's one of them. And it was a series of events leading up to this. The Darren Till knockout. Punching Leon Edwards with the 2 or 3 piece and a soda, backstage right after that Till fight. The flying knee from hell in the first few seconds versus Ben Askren. Shocking knockout. And he also clubbed him with those hammer fists after. Those weren't even hammer fists. That was like he was slamming a gate. And he landed both of them perfectly on Askren. He didn't have to take those last couple shots. But the knockout was so stunning that you couldn't even break them up in time because it happened like that. To the BMF beatdown versus Nate. There's a strong chance that this flame could get extinguished in this one. Or at least a huge setback. But look, Masvidal in one sense does want a shot at the title. He's worked so long for this, but he's also getting paid. So take your shot at the title and just know that even if you lose to Usman, as long as it's not like a humiliating style of loss or just one of those put you out cold type of knockouts, then there's still money to be had in a Masvidal versus Conor McGregor fight, Masvidal versus Colby Covington fight, Masvidal versus Nate Diaz 2. There are a lot of things that Masvidal can still do as long as this one isn't too bad. But yeah, he's got a ton of momentum and he's putting that on the line against Usman as the challenger. Risky business. Props to both fighters for taking it on this short notice, and props to the UFC for making it. UFC 251 is very different than it was less than a week ago. But let me know your thoughts on this championship showdown. Who are you taking in this fight and why? Leave your thoughts in the comments and I'll give them a look. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.